So thank you again to our several hosts, and it's always a pleasure to present together with my father. We spent a lot of time talking about these topics together, and I think our disciplines, mine in the interdisciplinary environmental humanities, and his in psychology and other branches of the social sciences, weave together rather powerfully in relation to these topics. So listening to Paul's presentation about the inconsistencies and sometimes kind of worrisome tendencies of the human mind, it's tempting to say uh, we have no way out of this predicament. A book that I often teach with by an American author named Roy Scranton is called "We're Doomed, Now What?" It's a collection of essays on war and climate change. We're doomed, now what? So, hearing about our inability to think coherently about numbers. The bigger the problems are, the less effective we are in contemplating the meaning of those numbers. It would be very easy to say, well, we are indeed doomed. And that may be the case when it comes to matters like climate change. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to push back. And in fact, here in the photo on my opening slide is of leading American writer Terry Tempest Williams. When I accompanied her and her husband to China a few years ago to interact with many of our counterparts in the environmental humanities, including the second lady of China, the wife of the premier with whom Terry is speaking. Her name is Cheng Hong. And Terry is attempting to convey, with her hands reaching out, a certain issue related to the environment, and this idea of trying to communicate effectively, despite the fact that it's difficult to register information, to make information meaningful. This is what I meant to convey with this particular image. So, why combine an explanation of the psychological aspects of the arithmetic of compassion, or what I'll call AOC, with a focus on how to communicate this information? And can we use an understanding of the cognitive processes that Paul was just discussing to help us improve our communication efforts when it comes to various forms of humanitarian and environmental crisis? So, Paul was laying out a problem, a very worrisome set of mechanisms in the human brain. But I would argue that understanding this psychology helps us to recognize and actually push back against our own insensitivity to information, or against the irrationality of the way we see our own minds working. So, having these names, psychic numbing, pseudo inefficacy, the prominence effect, just having those names and knowing a little bit about them enables us to recognize these tendencies in ourselves and compensate or push back against these tendencies. Also, I would argue that inherent in the psychological understanding of these mechanisms are various communication strategies, such as singularity, the power of the singular example, and the transscalar imaginary, the notion that our own brains might be flexible enough to move from the individual to the many, from the small example to the large scale phenomenon. And in these ideas, psychological ideas, might enable us to better understand information that others are trying to communicate to us, and also how we should share our own information if we wish to have an impact through our expression. And then also, I would say the story of the way Paul and I have attempted to develop our ideas and communicate these ideas related to AOC, combining academic publications and various forms of public outreach, might serve as a model for going public in other disciplines. I assume that many of the people attending this lecture are academics of one kind or another, and you may primarily do your work in a fairly limited communication environment where you're writing to colleagues in the same field. But there may be ways for us to go public, to reach out and use our understanding of our fields as a way of engaging with serious issues in the world. So perhaps we may be doomed, but we may have certain avenues for using this information in order to try to have some positive effect on the state of the world. So many of the ideas from Paul's talk originally appeared in academic articles, but then we attempted to compile them and various other related studies and other kinds of articles in a book that we published in 2015 called Numbers and Nerves: Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data. We divided this book into three sections, the first focusing on the psychological studies relevant to this work, such as what Paul was discussing. The second part focuses on narrative, analytical, and visual strategies for prompting or communicating sensitivity and meaning. So basically, how might certain communication strategies enable us to sidestep or surmount the impairment to sensitivity that Paul presented in his work? And then part three consists of several interviews that I conducted with leading communicators on how to convey numerical information to general audiences, non specialist audiences. And I thought it might be valuable to visit with these people and try to get their advice. What are some of the things that they think about as expert communicators when they're attempting to talk about toxicity or air pollution or other kinds of serious problems in the world? So, the term arithmetic of compassion, which is the overarching term that Paul and I use to describe these psychological conundrums that he presented in his work, these inconsistencies and paradoxes, that term actually comes from a 1974 poem by the Polish author Zbigniew Herbert. The title of the specific poem is Mr. Cogito Reads the Newspaper. And in the beginning of the introduction to Numbers and Nerves, we present the poem followed, each line followed by commentary by Paul and by me from our psychological and humanistic perspectives, analyzing the poem and connecting it to the ideas that we attempt to convey in the larger book. Paul's contributions to the book include articles such as one with the title of this lecture, The More Who Die, the Less We Care, on psychic numbing, pseudo inefficacy, and the prominence effect. And the prominence effect, as he described, is particularly important with situations such as the current war in Ukraine, where a lot of international response is dictated by a conflict between our valuation of human life, our concern for the lives of people who are imperiled, and concern for security. We're often, in many ways, blocked by intervention because we feel that we would undermine national security if we took certain steps. This is especially the case from the American perspective. It's also very much true of global climate change and the COVID pandemic. Often we espouse certain values. We care about the preservation of a habitable planet in the future, but we behave in our daily lives as if we didn't care about the climate and we didn't think there was any problem with global climate change. Likewise, we seem to be very concerned about public health, but often we behave in our daily lives as if there is no pandemic, whether in our mask wearing or not wearing behavior. Our gathering with large groups of people may seem irrational because these behaviors are risky during a pandemic, but there are other values and priorities, such as our attraction to social gatherings, that lead us to behave in contradiction to these values. These are often explainable by way of the prominence effect. In the news media and the coverage, for instance, of the war in Ukraine, we see that often journalists have an intuitive understanding of these psychological mechanisms that Paul was discussing. And there's a famous image of this mother who had just given birth around the time of the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol that it's received a lot of attention, this particular image. And it just obviously an effort by the journalists to overcome and facelessness by giving a face to this humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And there are many other examples like this, but I just heard that there was a maternity hospital bombed in southern Ukraine today or yesterday, and immediately I thought of this image. So this image from months ago helped to vivify for me and make real something that is happening today in which many other lives are affected. So the opening section of the Numbers and Nerves also offers an article by Robert J. Lifton, the psychologist who developed the very term psychic numbing. He did it in the context of some research he was doing in Japan following the bombing of Hiroshima in the 1960s, where he said psychic numbing was a survival mechanism, enabling people to withstand the devastating experience of a nuclear attack. And yet he, in a more recent article, The Age of Numbing, he and a colleague named Greg Mitchell said, we now live in an age where we're inundated not necessarily with nuclear bombs, but with information. And this information about crises tends to produce a type of numbing that is not conducive to survival. We are overwhelmed by information. We don't know what to do with it in many cases, and thus we are inactive in when we might positively engage with various crises. The second section turns to examples of and explanations about communication strategies by a variety of writers, Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, Annie Dillard, whom Paul mentioned a few times, Terry Tempest Williams, Bill McKibben. And I wrote an article on yet another mechanism, psychological mechanism, called the asymmetry of trust, which Paul and some of his colleagues have developed. My article focuses on the fact that it's much easier to destroy trust in information than it is to create or cultivate trust. So you have information by authorities about a subject like climate change, and all you need are a few naysayers to try to puncture or deflate that trust. And it's much easier for them to cause that dissipation of trust than it is for all of the authoritative scientists to build a strong sense that we ought to trust the science, or that we ought to trust the journalists who are telling us about some kind of crisis that is occurring. So the asymmetry of trust is a very serious worry that is connected to some of the literary examples that I talk about in the context of climate change. To some degree, we seem to be able to overcome psychological tendencies toward insensitivity and inaction by these approaches, to some degree, by communicating multidimensionally. This is the argument of Edward Tufte, the Yale University sociologist who specializes in writing about communicating quantitative information. And he argues that using many different dimensions, not just one strategy, but combining various strategies, and particularly by highlighting images, narratives, or storytelling, and by personalizing individual faces and stories, um, we might somehow counteract these tendencies toward insensitivity or toward numbness. And I would argue that also by understanding the psychological processes that are occurring and naming these processes and referring to them explicitly, we can warn our own listeners about what they might be experiencing and help them to counteract these tendencies toward insensitivity. So the elements, the images, narratives, personalizing stories and faces are elements of communication that highlight what psychologists refer to as the singularity effect. By telescoping back and forth, moving in and out between stories of individual cases and explanations of the larger contexts of humanitarian and environmental crises, communicators can work to sidestep the numbing effects of large-scale data and other modes of language, such as technical jargon, which Indian activist whom I interviewed for Numbers and Nerves, Vandana Shiva, calls the anesthesia of destruction. And the use of media that telescope back and forth between the one and the many, such as what Seattle-based photographer and filmmaker Chris Jordan calls the transcalar imaginary enables us to think, to move more pliably, with a kind of psychological pliability that enables us to overcome a kind of compassion fade that Paul describes. However, I would say most of us are tragically incapable of converting any kind of concern that we feel as a result of being moved by effective communication about these crises, humanitarian crises or environmental crises, any kind of moral angst that we feel, we have difficulty converting that to moral action and moving meaningfully between our sense of our small scale ability to act and our to have an effect on the large scale problems. So this struggle to move from the feeling of angst to the decision to act remains a serious problem. This is one of the things I discuss with various leading communicators for the third part of the book, Numbers and Nerves, including Mexican environmental and humanitarian activists Omero and Betty Aregis. And they respond specifically to their efforts through various, mostly literary efforts to communicate about air pollution and various other crises in Mexico, particularly in a personal, moral way. How to convey to people that these situations that may be occurring on other continents in vastly different parts of the world are have a personal connection to the reader or the viewer so that we might be compelled to engage. Shortly after the Numbers and Nerves book appeared, Paul and I and our colleagues decided to expand the project and connect the ideas of arithmetic of compassion more directly to current crises of various kinds in various parts of the world. So we developed a website called arithmeticofcompassion.org. And here you see the cover of the book, Numbers and Nerves, next to the homepage of the Arithmetic of Compassion website. The website includes overviews of the key psychological concepts that Paul was discussing related to human sensitivity and insensitivity to information, and also key relevant concepts from my field, the environmental humanities. Also happens to be the field of our moderator for today's lecture, Professor Mowetsky. One of these key concepts from the environmental humanities is from Princeton professor Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he says that slow violence is a way of understanding the difficulty of representing destructive phenomena that occur slowly, out of sight, and in a non-spectacular way, such as climate change, extinction, and also even other phenomena such as the spread of disease, which is relevant to our pandemic context. We can't see these things happening as we walk down the street, and thus they occur in a way that's difficult to apprehend. And it's incumbent on certain types of communicators, which Nixon calls writer activists, to find ways to use their voices in order to compel attention and enable us to perceive and grasp these phenomena. The blog section of the website, arithmeticofcompassion.org, is regularly updated and now has more than 100 essays, interviews, and reviews highlighting the relevance of these AOC concepts to both chronic and acute crises. For instance, in the past year, we published a blog entry published anonymously by someone who felt it would not be safe to use a name because of family members based in a war-torn portion of Ethiopia called Tigray. And so we're trying to use the website to provide a forum for people to offer personal testimony about phenomena that they think the public should be more aware of. The title of this piece is Tigray, Testimony from Afar. And one of the focuses of this is not on being a victim of a crisis, but the pain of being of secondhand trauma, as we call it. concern about family members who are back in Ethiopia or in Tigray and likely susceptible to various types of harsh treatment in that military conflict. So, in this particular blog, we have not only the statement by the author, but we offer a small essay at the beginning explaining the use of personal testimony, which is conscious of the singularity effect and the way of telling a poignant story by emphasizing the individual experience of the author in feeling concern about family members back in this war-torn part of the world. We have many other examples of testimony, many of them related to genocide of various kinds. Also, one related to the pandemic here, an intensive care unit nurse's perspective on COVID-19, and political activist Anna Albath from Minority Rights Group has a piece of testimony about the refugee crisis on the Polish border. I think particularly the border between Poland and Belarusia, and the predicament of refugees who are stranded in a kind of no man's land between these two national borders. But she presents this as a form of personal testimony, using an awareness of the arithmetic of compassion as a way of telling that story. I've also done some interviews with expert communicators in the blog section. For instance, an interview with Sharman Apt Russell on childhood malnutrition, in which I ask her directly certain questions about communication strategies. Here, for instance, are Sharman Russell's comments on the use of stories in her book on childhood malnutrition. And she talks about her great understanding, her direct conscious awareness of storytelling as a way of taking a larger sociological, economic, and biological problem of malnutrition and trying to present it to her general audience by way of stories about scientists and stories about the people living in parts of the world, such as Malawi, where she's particularly lived at various times in her life, who are prone to childhood malnutrition. Last spring, I worked with the Canadian doctoral student in anthropology, Amy Donovan, to do a written interview on a very different type of crisis, which is the crisis of whales who are victimized by oil prospecting in the northern oceans. And she wrote a fascinating essay called Raw, Dense, and Loud, which is a whale's perspective on cold water energy prospecting. And I found her article so fascinating and impressive that I arranged to do an interview with her on how she experiments with language in order to communicate the vulnerability of whales in relation to the field that she studies, which is called trans-species empathy. And so Donovan's article uses multidimensional prose. Think back to Edward Tufte, the notion of multidimensional communication strategies. She uses fictional narrative, neuroscience, cetology or whale science, literary criticism, petroleum engineering, and various other types of voices and discourses in order to draw readers into the experience of whales in the northern seas. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock here and realizing I need to finish up soon so that we can have some time for Q&A. But in the interview with her about her language style, here she says, for instance, I aim in my own writing for a kind of tangible crackle, lively, material, interactive, not pretending to aim for objectivity. I've done my best to avert factual error in terms of whales' physiologies as science currently understands them. But I hope the more important part of my essay is the texture, the rendering tangible of something that is by nature difficult for the human brain, that is trans-species empathy. If you think it's difficult to put your feet into two different types of shoes, as in the Cuban sculpture that Paul presented. Imagine what it would be to put your feet into a whale's fins and empathize with the whale's experience of the world. This is what a writer like Amy Donovan is attempting to do in her writing, to make us feel the way the whale might experience the world. So we've also published a short story by an Indian writer attempting to evoke sensitivity to the plight of handicapped children in rural India, yet another type of social crisis in Kerala, her part of the world. These efforts to understand and represent uh, particular forms of vulnerability are what we call in the environmental humanities precarity, or in a non-human context, eco-precarity. And one of the leading scholars in this area of study is Pramod K. Nayar from the University of Hyderabad in India, who's authored a few books lately on Bhopal's ecological Gothic and industrial disasters, and the implications of communicating precarity of the Bhopal tradition of expression. Also writing a little bit about the non-human context in a recent book called Eco-Precarity. And Nayar now has a UNESCO chair in vulnerability studies at the University of Hyderabad. And this notion of conveying and understanding the way we think about precarity has become a very large and widely recognized field of study in the humanities. We also have scholars in the environmental humanities, such as Heather Hauser from the University of Texas, Austin, who, going back to what I said earlier about being overwhelmed by data, too much information, her book focuses on climate information and various strategies by visual artists and writers in order to make data experiential, as she says in one of her chapter titles from the 2020 book InfoWhelm. Um, and have various articles, some of them on the Arithmetic of Compassion website, on making toxicity through industrial contamination poignant and meaningful to people by way of poetry, and also the difficulty of writing in a way that is moving to broad audiences. There have been several publications of the world scientists' warnings to humanity about the seriousness of climate change, but I find that these world scientists' warnings are often written in ways that are heart squashing. They're dull. They don't present a sense of vivid emotional narrative energy that would draw us into these subjects and make us care about them, give us a kind of human meaning. And so I wrote a study of the world scientists' warnings to humanity, criticizing that language and suggesting some alternatives. One of the fields in which Wojciech Małecki, our moderator, and I are attempting to offer some new contributions is the field of empirical eco-criticism, the empirical study of environmental texts in order to understand how they affect audiences' ways of thinking. The broader field might be called empirical cognitive narratology. And so much of what I've been describing here about the way we might communicate in order to overcome limitations in audiences' sensitivity to certain subjects, we're just beginning to understand by doing empirical studies of the way audiences react to different types of language. And so this notion of empirical cognitive narratology is a rapidly growing field that will help us to refine our appreciation of the effectiveness of various communication strategies. I try to use these ideas based on what I know now in teaching testimony writing at various universities and sometimes outside of universities around the world. Here, I'm teaching testimony writing and other forms of environmental writing to a group of graduate students at a university in Malaysia. This is a Nigerian student who's just written testimony about desertification, the expanding Sahara Desert in his home region of northern Nigeria. I also incorporate this into the classes I teach on environmental writing, where a final project requires students to write personal testimony that they might present at a public meeting of some kind. And here the students are reading their testimonies to the rest of the class, and they also are required to write two letters of testifying about their concerns through their personal experience. Um, uh, which are written, these letters are written to corporate, government, or university officials. So I ask the students not just to think about some of these ideas abstractly, but to practice certain types of expression that they might use in their lives as engaged citizens, in order to actually act in response to issues that they find worrisome. And I also attempt to practice what I preach, writing um, various types of op-eds, sometimes with Paul for a variety of publications. And when asked, I'll show up at a public meeting, a public event, such as this climate change march in Idaho, and stand up and give a talk, attempting to weave some of my understanding of these psychological mechanisms into my own presentation on various topics. So this is my last slide. The overarching goal of the Numbers and Nerves and Arithmetic of Compassion projects is to help people become aware of the psychological and communication aspects of information processing in the context of humanitarian and environmental crises. So I've attempted to offer a brief overview of the history and content of these projects here. And at this point, I think we can begin our Q&A session for as long as we have. Thank you.